So good morning and welcome to our Active Teaching and Learning Online webinar. And we have a fabulous group of panelists. So if each of the panelists would like to introduce themselves briefly, I would appreciate that. Just say who you are and what some of your experience with online might be. Beth, would you kick this off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name is Beth Oyarzin, and I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Learning Design Technology program. And my experience in online teaching is my first online class I taught in 2005. So I've been through the gamut of different technologies and different online courses. I also train faculty to teach online. Prior to being faculty, I was an instructional designer. So that's me.
Thank you so much. Lynn, if you don't mind going next.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lynn Wall. I'm an instructional designer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. Before I became an instructional designer about 5 years ago, I taught for 8 years at a community college as a full-time faculty doing English composition, technical writing, and literature classes, mostly all online, with also synchronous online classes. So I'm just very excited to see this session, and I hope that I can offer some insight.
Thank you very much. Bobby, if you're with us, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bobby Hobgood. I am director of the Language Resource Center in the Department of Languages and Culture Studies. I also teach French in the department and am an associate in the College of Education, where I teach advanced foreign language methods and advanced pedagogy for TESOL. I've been teaching online since 1996. Let me say that again, 1996. Yes, I'm really that old. I know it's hard for you to believe that, but it's true. And when I was at a previous institution down the road a little bit in a town called Chapel Hill, I actually created an online program for faculty in the university through the Center for Faculty Excellence that was an experiential approach to learning how to teach online. So I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Howdini, if you'd go next, please.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Howdini Prasad. I'm a teaching associate professor in the College of Computing and Informatics. So I've been using a variety of different active learning techniques in a lot of my face-to-face classes. And more recently, I've started translating these active learning techniques to a fully online setting. And I guess that's kind of why I'm here. I don't have as many years of experience teaching online as some of the others on the panel do, but hopefully I can contribute some of what I've done to translate my active learning techniques to online.
Thank you so much. Meredith?
Excuse me. I'm Meredith Trotman Jordan, and I'm in the School of Nursing, and I was pleased to see some familiar faces here. I have been teaching online, at least in part online. I've kind of shifted more and more over the years, but for about 16 years now, I've always had an electronic component to my classes. And then I think I taught my first completely online class about 12 years ago, maybe. So currently I teach online courses as well as a hybrid course, which is a clinical course that I got Quality Matters certified. I have experience teaching synchronous as well as asynchronous online courses. And one of the challenges that I've had, which was kind of surprising, but finding ways to actively engage students even more, to me, is even more challenging with these synchronous courses rather than asynchronous. So I've learned a lot over the past couple of years and spent time working on increasing my knowledge and familiarity with use of tools to make students more actively involved during those synchronous times, so uses of polling, whiteboard, etc. And I'm pleased to be here today.
Thank you so much. And Victoria?
Hey, also great to be here and happy to be here. So I'm Victoria Scott. I'm faculty in the Department of Psychological Sciences. Have been teaching online for maybe about 3-4 years now, and mostly in a hybrid fashion. But I teach a community psych course where the active engagement is a real critical part of the conversation and fostering that sense of community. So delighted to be on with y'all.
Thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us today. We're really excited, and what we're going to kick off with today is our starting question, which is, what is the biggest challenge you faced using active learning online, and how did you overcome it, or how have you been working to overcome it is maybe another way to say it. So let's hear from our panelists, and feel free to jump in. I know on WebEx it can be a little bit challenging, but we will do our best. And again, anyone can use the raise hand feature or the chat feature to get my attention if you need it. So what's the biggest challenge?
I could start if nobody else wants to. So for me, the biggest challenge was teamwork and participation. And I'll give a little bit of a background. I teach a software systems design and implementation course. And for something like software design and development, hands-on activities and projects are a big part of the course. And that's how students actually learn how to design and develop software. And in the real world, software development is pretty much always done in teams. So I want my students to have that same experience in my courses, even when the course is completely online. So the main challenge that I faced, there's actually two parts to that challenge. One was, how do I facilitate effective teamwork in the online setting? And then two, how do I ensure timely participation of students in that teamwork? The focus being the timely, right? So for the first part, I rely a lot on collaboration tools. Meredith already mentioned some of them. So there's a lot of online whiteboard tools and project management tools out there. And one tool that I found particularly good for my own class is called Miro, M-I-R-O. This basically allows students to create a team board where they're able to brainstorm simply by using Post-its. They can share ideas. They can put together mock-ups of application screens. There's a chat feature, a commenting feature, and much more in this tool. And again, this is not the only tool out there like this. The nice thing is they can use the tool both asynchronously and in real time. So students can go in whenever they want ideas onto the tool, but if they're online at the same time, they see each other, they can talk to each other and so on. So I ask my students to add me to their Miro board and the teaching assistants if there are any, and that helps me give them feedback right there in the board. And it also tells me which students have contributed to the board and in what way, right? Who's sharing ideas, etc. And the second part of the challenge, like I said, is ensuring participation from all team members. For this, I used a very simple technique eventually, which was to set up intermediate deadlines during the week. So students still have flexibility of working asynchronously. So I'm not setting a 2-hour window in which they have to do something, but I do have a window of, say, 2 or 3 days in which they have to complete certain phases of whatever activity it is that they're working on that week. And I also build in a feedback phase there. So there are specific days of the week I tell them I'm going to go into their board and look at it and give them feedback. So that's helped them participate in a timely way, because otherwise students tend to push everything to just a couple of hours before the deadline, which doesn't really work well when we're trying to get them to collaborate asynchronously.
Fabulous, excellent points.
To piggyback on that, if you don't mind, collaborative learning and working in groups, I've had the challenge of group creation. And I've noticed that when I allow students to sort of group themselves, I put parameters around it, and I have them create a group work profile at the beginning of the course that details, their working style, what tools they like to use, when they like to work as far as their schedule is concerned, with family and school going on. A lot of them have different types of schedules. So they build this little profile, and then based on the profile, they can select their groups based on the project description. And I found that really helpful in the onset of group work.
So this is Victoria. I teach a community psych course where a core part of the conversation requires students to move into zones of discomfort in the way of holding sensitive conversations and difficult conversations. They might pertain to issues of racism, in other aspects of human diversity. And I've found that there's a lot of pre-work that's needed in order for students to be comfortable engaging in these kind of conversations, especially in an online format. And so some of the, I guess, best practices that I've found to be useful is establishing the sort of touchstones or ways for being together, or sort of guiding principles or ways to hold that space together at the front end of those conversations, and sharing explicitly that, you know, the goal is to surface different views, acknowledging that the conversations can be difficult, and that the goal in the way of having those conversations is not to come to a single truth or to have that necessarily shared agreement on a particular set of experiences. And so I've found that in the way of active engagement and encouraging folks to lean in, that it can be really helpful to that a really important aspect is just that framing of the conversation up front, to allow students to ease into the conversation. And then the other aspect that I've found to be helpful for me in the way of engaging students is the work that happens outside of the classroom in the way of the individual conversations and outreach with students that help to foster that sense of connectivity to the class, so that when there are synchronous class periods, my observation is that they're more inclined to engage then and even show up because they feel like their presence or absence is noticed in the room.
Hello, this is Bobby. I want to share a couple of techniques that I've been using since we've started teaching remotely. First of all, I should give you some context and tell you that two of the classes that I'm currently teaching now remotely had been taught in an active learning space. The Language Resource Center in the Department of Languages and Culture Studies was completely renovated almost 3 years ago now into is now a very unique active learning space for learning and teaching world languages. So going from a space where I had access to wonderful tools to a situation where my tools are all virtual really forced me to think very carefully about what I call a learning pathway, meaning in the face-to-face setting, I had to prepare for each class by putting materials out in the proper place, arranging whiteboards where they were needed, making sure markers were ready, queuing up resources like video and audio, etc. So then moving to the remote setting, I had to think, well, you know, so what are the counterparts of that and how do I create this learning pathway? So to tag on with a little bit of what Victoria was saying earlier, just that planning piece, I think Victoria is so essential in anticipation of how do we envision students interacting with one another. In my case, one of the courses I'm currently teaching remotely is a French 2 course. And as you all probably know, teaching and learning a language really requires a lot of interactivity. So there's all sorts of communication that goes on. And one of the challenges for me was, while in the face-to-face classroom, I can read body language, as we all can, and I can pick up on those verbal and nonverbal cues that communicate to what extent students are understanding new language. Even though we have the small windows, you know, it's been interesting. Some of my students don't want to use the webcam at all. In fact, I think maybe I fell into that trap of thinking that by virtue of their birthright and their age, that they would all be all over using the technology and be more than willing to share themselves via video. And that actually has not been the case. There have been a number of students who communicated to me privately that they didn't want to show their webcam. So given that challenge, I had to figure out, so now I don't even have a video, a small head that I can read and see, the heads going up and down. So I had to think of other ways to get input from students. And so one technique I've been using with great success that took a little bit of setup for the students was asking students to answer questions as an entire class. So we often talk about total class participation techniques so that, I can read what's going on in the room. So I'll ask them to answer a question in the chat room, but to send their answer to me privately. So if you know what I'm talking about there, just above the chat window is the drop down that allows you to send a message to everyone, to the host, or to someone else in the room. And so rather than one student responding via text to the question, what's the weather like today? Or tell me what you like to do. What was your favorite activity when you were a child? Now they can all do that to me privately, okay? And it's a great technique that serves a number of purposes. Number one, it keeps them engaged, obviously, because they're not sitting still and just listening to me talk or watching something happen on the screen, but they're actively responding, and they're also giving me some feedback that helps me gauge to what extent the class understands what's going on. So if it's a very simple question like, what's the weather today? At a glance, I can determine, oh, okay, 75% or so understand, 25% don't. So that's one of the strategies I've been using. And then another very quick strategy with respect to groups, because that's also a big part of learning a language. I've learned early on that I really did not want students to choose their own groups. And I'm not so comfortable with the automatic group formation within WebEx and in Zoom. So then the question becomes, well, how do you do that efficiently without taking up class time? So I tell my students that they have to arrive in our synchronous classes 15 minutes before it starts. And of course, there's some who arrive at the last minute, which is fine. But as they start to arrive, then I start to populate them in the breakout rooms. And so that saves me a lot of time. And there's always a warm-up activity. So for those students who arrive late, I can take time to then put them in the appropriate groups. So those are just a couple of techniques, but I guess the big takeaway or the big advice that I would give in terms of challenges is, again, to really think ahead and to consider what's the learner pathway? What are the ways in which we're going to ask students to engage and interact with us throughout a synchronous lesson?
I'd like to add a very quick follow-up to that, if that's okay. So Bobby, towards the end, mentioned adding students dynamically to breakout sessions, etc., and that works great if the breakout sessions or teams are not pre-formed. In classes where you might already have these teams set up, you could require that students register for your WebEx sessions ahead of time. And then that enables you to actually pre-assign breakout sessions. Again, that's if you already have pre-assigned teams in your class.
These are fabulous. For our remaining panelists, what are some challenge thoughts that you might have at this time that you would like to share with the group? And as we hear more and more from our panelists, please remember that as you think of questions or comments or ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will address those and take a look at them, everybody. So what else are you all thinking?
So one thing, this is Lynn, one thing that I really struggled with when I was teaching online is the sort of supreme irony of teaching actively and what ends up happening with that, if you think about a composition class, rather than students passively engaging with things, they're actively engaging with them, which means they're doing something with it, which then creates a lot of student product, right? A lot of student work. And so we all know that if things are optional, a lot of times students won't do it. So then you have to, you put a grade on it, and then they're turning it in, and then all of a sudden you have all this feedback that you have to provide. So balancing the instructor feedback load with active learning in the online space can be really overwhelming. And it was only later when I was meeting with other faculty in writing that I realized the best strategy for that is to think very, very hard about exactly what Bobby was referencing, which was the learning pathway of what out of the activities that students are doing, what absolutely needs feedback from you as the instructor in order to help students improve their understanding, what needs feedback from other students in the class, like what can you do peer feedback for, and what do students simply need to complete and then reflect on their own time. And then how do you go about setting up those sort of activities using the technology that we have? So ideas of like using Google Documents for ongoing journals that are graded not every week, but maybe every 3 weeks, or having students turn in all of the setup documents that you may not give them feedback on very specifically, like a list of all of their topic sentences for an essay, but you would like to see that they did that before they went to actually write the paper. Well, you can have them turn that in with the paper and grade it all at once there so that you can help balance those feedback things. So mapping it out on a calendar of what's getting turned in, when do you have time to grade it? Do you have time to grade it? If not, maybe make that a peer activity. So just kind of thinking about that feedback load with your active learning so that students just aren't doing stuff and then not hearing anything from you as the instructor.
That's a good point, Lynn. And I would like to add to that different types of feedback can be helpful. For example, if you have an assignment that is turned in that is in need of a lot of feedback, instead of typing that feedback, consider giving a video. That can save you time and still allow you to provide that rich feedback.
One other thing that I'd like to add as well, I absolutely agree, first of all, that the feedback thing is a big challenge that everyone needs to think about when they're teaching online. For some types of things, I have discussion forums and simple quizzes that students take. And for those types of things, I post what I call follow-up notes. So it's not feedback to individual students based on their answers, but I look at the summary of answers. For example, if you had a Poll Everywhere survey and you see that 25% of the students got this answer wrong, then it's kind of nice to have a full class follow-up post of some sort. That way you're not spending the time giving each individual student feedback, but you're also giving that information to your students.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that, Howdini. I agree 100%. It can be from the front end. We can lose sight of the workload on us in terms of managing all of the input, the content, and the information students share with us. It's twice as bad when you then think about, oh, but you got another class too, and then what if those deadlines overlap, which happened to me just last week. It was nightmarish. So one of the things I like to do, rather than, as Howdini, you offered, rather than responding individually to every student, both in my completely asynchronous online course and then in blended courses, I've done what I call a summary video at the end of a module or end of a unit. You decide when is most appropriate. And during that particular module or week, I've just been collecting maybe some ideas from students. Maybe it's something that they shared during a synchronous session. Maybe it's something that they shared in a discussion forum. And so then I do maybe a 4 to 5 minute video of myself. And sometimes I'll use slides to draw attention to certain things and just kind of highlight, some of the big ideas and then touch upon the areas that were most problematic for students. And it's an opportunity to also say, well, students who did well on this particular activity did the following things, you know. And then in that case, I wouldn't necessarily single out a particular student, but rather just provide that kind of global feedback. I've been doing this now for about 6 years, and my students have told me that they really appreciate that kind of feedback, because the secondary gain from such a strategy is that it provides students with another opportunity to revisit or rethink that content, that information. So as we think about the value, especially for me when I think about language courses, the value of repetition, the ability to be able to hear something again, or perhaps hear it cast in a different light, there's great return on that. So on the one hand, you might hear, ooh, you're making this summary video and you do it weekly. Geez, that sounds like a lot of work. And truth be told, initially it is, but the return on investment, I think, really pays off and is worth it. And over time, you develop techniques and facility with things that make those sorts of additions to your course, again, very worthwhile.
Thank you for all of your comments so far. I'm going to make one quick change on our screens. I realize that staring at the same question this entire time is visually a little bit boring, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I just wanted everyone to know that when I stop sharing, that means that you should then be seeing people's videos. So now we've got some faces and we're all a little bit more interactive, so I've changed that. And as you're, again, listening to our panelists, think about also challenges that you yourself are already facing to our audience, or challenges that you also would potentially like some ideas from colleagues on how to handle. But for any panelists that still have thoughts they want to share, go ahead and jump back in. I just wanted to change our view a little bit because that was getting kind of sad.
Thanks, Jessica. Maybe piggybacking on a comment that Bobby made when he first spoke, and then this notion of feedback is, Bobby, when you were sharing about synchronous instruction and that sense of sometimes not knowing how things are going for students, it connected with one of the strategies that I use and that I found to be helpful, which is inviting the feedback from students after each course. And so what I've adopted into my courses is I use Google Forms to develop Google Forms that has 2 questions. One is, what are you taking away from today's class? And then question 2 is, what questions, comments, or suggestions do you have? And those, the link to that, those 2 questions are always posted at the end of each class period. And it's a way for me to get somewhat just-in-time feedback from the students on how each session is going and what issues are hitting home for them, what issues they're still sitting with and struggling with, and then any suggestions. Sometimes they tell me they don't like the small group work or the breakout sessions. They prefer, XYZ to be in large group. And so that's tying to that notion of feedback, but from a student perspective, it's one way that I've found to be helpful in the way of just keeping a pulse on how students are doing in the classroom. And then in the way of balancing sort of the workload, the comments that Lynn was making, what I do to not overwhelm myself is I, in essence, look through the set of responses, and then where there are questions, I post them in the discussion board just as a Q&A. So their question and then my response, and then the next question and my response. And so because that's become part of the routine, students know to look to the discussion thread for any kind of questions that they had for that week in prep for the subsequent week. And so it's twofold. It provides me with a sense of how they're doing, what they're taking away from the class, and what's resonating versus what isn't. And then it's a way for students to also stay informed. And I think that strategy works well for students who are a little more reticent to speak in a virtual group format.
There was a question a moment ago in the chat about what kind of outreach outside of class, Victoria, that you were mentioning before. I was just wondering if you might could answer that. And before you do, real quick, I wanted to say that an outreach that I do outside of class is to send an individual email at some point in the semester. You can split up the class in groups and not do it all in one sitting. But I found that that's really helpful for students to open that line of communication. If you do it individually rather than as a group, then they're more likely to contact you with questions. You're muted, Victoria. You're muted still.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that question to my attention. And Beth, that has been my experience too, in that the individual outreach seems to be most effective. And so the nature of my outreach is generally threefold. One is an expression of concern, a checking in with folks. And so it's not in a punitive format, but if I've noticed a student hasn't come for at least 2 consecutive class periods, then I'll just send a note to say, hey, I've noticed that you've not been present in the last 2 classes. So these are virtual sessions, synchronous virtual sessions. And I say, just want to check in on you. How are you doing? Many a times the students will respond with, sorry, XYZ, sorry I had to work or something like that. And I'll respond back and say, apology not needed, but just wanted to check in to make sure that you're doing well. And that almost always is followed within their engagement, or they're showing up for the next class period. And then other outreaches is just compliments when students are actively engaged in the class period. Then I'll just drop a quick message, say, hey, really appreciate your engagement today. What a valuable contribution, or whatever. Specificity is helpful. And there is one third reason that I tend to reach out, and it's just escaping me. So maybe I can chime back in when I recall. Thanks for the question.
So from our audience then, what are some other challenges that you are also experiencing, or even ones that you're still trying to think of effective ways to meet, or even just any thoughts in general, or things that you've come across that you feel like, hey, this is something cool that I've found as well that I would like to share? Feel free to put them in the chat. I do know that somebody had asked Beth for an example of the group profiles, and she said that we would follow up in an email about that. Earlier, someone had asked what kind of outreach outside of class you do, Victoria. So maybe if we haven't addressed that, if you want to take a moment to address that.
Yes, and I believe that's the one that Beth just asked, but the third one for the cliffhanger, the third one, and why it was a little fuzzy for me is it's been unique to the COVID-19 just situation that we're in. And so the third reason I've been reaching out to folks is really just to check in for folks who have shared privately with me that they suffer from depression or other personal circumstances. They have a family member that's not well. I've just been more cognizant to reach out to them individually and check in. And for students who are experiencing depression, it's not so much to step into their space and ask them to share how they're doing in the way of answering questions, but sometimes it'll be just sharing a poem, just to let them know that that they're still being thought of, and that, even if they're not present for class, that they're still recognized as part of the class. And so the third reason for outreach has really been much more specific to just what we're all experiencing in light of the pandemic.
Gotcha. And Joan has a follow-up question in our chat that talks about how faculty have been concerned about students who just seem to drop off maybe this semester. How much do any of our panelists feel about pursuing students? How much do you feel you should pursue students? Some faculty are worried about their students, of course, you know, what Victoria's talking about. We're all, you know, we're all human and we want to reach out to those, but how much do you find is a good balance for reaching out?
Hi, this is Bobby. So I'm so glad, Joan, that you posed this question because I think, frankly, it's something that everybody is dealing with to one degree or another. I found out some things about my students I had no idea about when we transitioned to teaching remotely. The very first week, used an anonymous survey to get a little bit of information. And one of the questions I kind of sneaked in there was that open-ended generic question of, is there anything else you would like for me to know about your participation now that we are learning remotely? And it was very sobering, you know, to find out everything from one of my students was homeless and wasn't sure where they were going to live, to another student who didn't get along with their parents and had to move back in with their parents. And so since then, I've been very cognizant of, you know, how much do I expect of students? As a department, we decided that we're not going to take attendance anymore. So we've kind of stopped doing that. But some of those students, and again, not knowing who they were, reached out anonymously. I did want to follow up with them. So on a couple of occasions, I've again sent out an anonymous survey just to say, you know, hey, I'm just trying to get a pulse on how things are going for you. Tell me what it's like to learn in this environment. And I try not to ask anything that is going to make them think that I'm prying into their personal lives. But then I always include that one question, is there anything else that you would like for me to know about your participation? And so I think when you frame it in that way, then it's not taken as, oh, you know, this person is trying to pry into my life right now. I'm not comfortable sharing that. So the result actually ends up being that they do share with you. At least that's been my case thus far. So while I'm by no means an expert on this, I do think it has been beneficial for me and for my students, because just by virtue of doing so, they are aware that I am sensitive to the fact that some of them are sharing the internet with 5 other people in the house. Some of them are sharing their one computer with somebody else. And some of them don't have consistent access to a computer and or the internet.
Any other comments along that particular vein, the amount of outreach to students? Right.
In the individual check-in email that I mentioned previously, I did something similar to Bobby and just said, you know, the due dates are remaining in my course is asynchronous. So I let the due dates stand in the course, but I said, if you are having some sort of challenge that you're unable to make the due dates, that I remain flexible and supportive. If you would just communicate with me what your challenges are, we can work around them. And that seems to have been helpful. And I learned a lot as well from asking that question.
Jessica, I'd like to ask a question that might open Pandora's box. So
go for it. We've got a couple in the chat, but go for it. We will get around to them all.
FYI, so I've been working a lot with the faculty in my department just by virtue of my role in the department. So I've been providing a lot of support, both department-wide and one-on-one. And the one issue that for my department has been a real hot issue and continues to be, I mean, on a daily basis, I get emails about this, is the issue of assessment online and remotely. And so we've gone through as a department this whole idea of, okay, here are the tools available to us, you know, respond us monitor. Here are some strategies you can use with Canvas quizzes to, if nothing else, maybe minimize a little bit some of the potential for cheating. Nonetheless, there's some folks who just almost perseverate, if that's the word, you know, on I can't, what can I do to prevent students from cheating? And so one of the suggestions I've given them is, you know, in the absence or outside of select response assessments, is to rethink the assessment altogether so that it wouldn't matter if they had access to all the resources in the world. They could phone a friend if they want, you know, they could Google until their fingers bleed and it wouldn't make a difference, you know. So rethink the assessment rather than asking for, you know, the report on a famous biologist. Instead, ask for that person's resume, you know, so then think about that. You're less likely to find that person's resume on the web than you are to find an already written essay. So I'm curious what others think about and what others are doing with respect to assessments right now since we've gone remotely. And I recognize too that there's a difference in what we're doing right now, i.e. having gone remotely, because I frankly don't refer to this as online instruction at all. This is remote instruction. And I think there's a difference. The distinction for me is that with online teaching, you are very intentional and you have had the opportunity to prepare in advance and anticipate, whereas what we have been forced into now, we really have almost no time, you know, to be forced into. So again, my question is, what's everybody thinking about assessment right now, and how are you handling that?
I'd like to add to that. I mean, first of all, yes, I think our department, our college, we're all going through the same thing as well. There are a lot of instructors that are really worried about ways that students will find to cheat. For my own course, I'm taking a route similar to what Bobby said, which is my questions or my tests are completely open book, open notes, open whatever. And I use question banks with a lot of different questions as well. In addition to that, that helps a lot. So there's, even if students collaborate, they're not going to get very far doing that. That's the idea. So I agree with Bobby. It's sort of rethinking the way you do your assessments. I also noticed a couple of questions on the chat window. Jessica, is now a good time to address some of those, or?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say we've had a couple that we can also start chatting about. So for example, I had someone who made a comment that it sounds like active learning really needs to happen in a synchronous setting. And is that true?
So I think Beth kind of partially answered that already, and I agree with her. No, active learning can very much happen in an asynchronous setting as well. So the example that I was talking about in the very beginning, where I said they can use these online whiteboarding tools, etc., that can actually be completely asynchronous. There are discussion forums that can be completely asynchronous. So in truly online classes, most of the active learning will be asynchronous. One other type of thing that I've done in my fully online class is have a discussion forum and followed by a poll everywhere survey that's tied to the points in the discussion forum. So they get a chance to talk to their team as part of the discussion forum, and then they go in and answer a poll everywhere survey individually. And there can be a follow-up after that from the instructor. They can be allowed to see the poll everywhere survey results so they understand how the statistics look in the class, etc. So there's lots of active learning techniques that you can use in an asynchronous setting itself.
And to piggyback on that, and there was a question in there about group work and how that works as well in asynchronous online classes. And I think you can sort of address both of those questions with courses that have a culminating project that usually submitted at the end of the course, rethinking that and stretching it into parts that are due in different stages throughout the course. not only increases the quality of that product, but it also creates additional feedback points and touches with other students in the class and with the instructor. So really thinking about that project and how it could be segmented and delivered asynchronously in parts is very helpful.
Which I think helps touch on this types of activities done online during synchronous online classes, as well as structuring of the course for active learning in those asynchronous formats. And there's, some points in here about future semesters. And I think that a lot of faculty and a lot of us are sort of already cautiously in this mindset of, is this something that will continue? We already know that summer is going to be online, but is this going to potentially continue even further than that? So I think that a lot of these challenges and questions are going to remain or increase, especially given that in spring, it was sort of a last second, let's all jump and quickly change the plan. Whereas for summer, it feels like, well, now it's at least somewhat more planable in the sense that the semester hasn't started yet. We don't have to shift gears so quickly. But I think that a lot of these are going to continue for that. So for thinking towards the future, what are maybe some changes that now that you've had some more experience with doing some of these things that you either are hoping to do differently if this continues in future semesters, or just things that you thought, this went really well, I want to continue this regardless of format of class?
Yeah, I'd like to really jump in on this one. I apologize for talking so much, but the whole conversation today is so important to me and so intriguing because if nothing else, everybody is challenged in various ways by our current operational status. But I think that the positive side is that, again, if nothing else, we have been really forced to take a different look at what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And, I think Sojourner Truth said, if you want change in your life, walk into a storm. And we certainly have been provided such an opportunity. As I look towards summer school, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this. So I've never taught summer school. And my department chair has asked me, I was supposed to teach second summer face-to-face. Now she's asked me to teach first summer and to also create somewhat of a model for some of our language courses, our elementary, intermediate language courses that are blended. So a combination of, the synchronous and asynchronous. And so one of the things that I've really been racking my brain with is, in summer school, 5 weeks, 2 hours a day for 4 days a week, that's 8 hours. I don't think there's any way in the world anybody would have 8 hours of synchronous sessions with students during summer school. I mean, I think that's going to kill the kids. It's going to kill you, So one of the questions I have for the panel, for all of us is, Jessica, you were mentioning, now we have the time to plan ahead. So when planning ahead for summer school, what's the balance? How do we think about the balance? Because one of the problems is if you publicize your course as being online for summer school, and they all are this summer, unless you got in under the gun, and I did, by the way, yay me, you have to teach mostly asynchronous. Of course, you can do a doodle poll or when is good and, have some synchronous sessions. But I was able to get in there that students need to be prepared from 10 to 12, Monday through Thursday. Well, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to do kind of a combination. But I'm curious, what do others think about summer school? And how do you balance the need for synchronous versus asynchronous?
So in our college, we kind of decided that we would try to keep classes asynchronous this summer to the extent possible. And there are a couple of classes that used to have lab sessions where the instructor strongly felt that a synchronous component would be necessary. For those, we did add short synchronous times, not the entire 7 hours a week, but much shorter sessions. For a lot of the other courses, I believe the plan is that instructors can still offer synchronous office hour slots and so on to have those individual or small group discussions, but try to keep most of the actual course activities, the weekly activities, asynchronous as possible. Like Bobby said, it's basically for that flexibility because finding 7 or 8 hours of synchronous time is going to be really challenging for a lot of faculty and for students during this time.
Thank you everyone for your comments on that. We do have a couple minutes left in the session, so if there are any lingering questions, please go ahead and quickly post them in the chat. I'm also going to reach out to our panelists and see if there's any tips or information or links to any materials that they want to send. Again, Beth already mentioned one list that she would give me. So I see something in the chat. Working with students and directors' ideas was all synchronous, so we're thinking about this, balancing work with one group after a week, and after they do some of the work on their own, perhaps, and also mentors. I think that here's a curious question that I have that I think might be beneficial to everyone. Do you find that you're able to utilize TAs if you have a TA in the same way that you used to? I guess I should ask if any of you have a TA before I pose that question.
I wish I had a TA.
I was assuming with a large panel somebody would, but I'm curious.
I do. I'm lucky enough to have TAs. I teach a class that's 128 students this semester, and we suddenly switched to remote teaching. My TAs have still been very, very useful to me in two different ways. One is even though it's not mandatory, I still have my synchronous class sessions just in case someone wants to come in and get help during that time. And I use breakout sessions in WebEx during that time. And, you know, if 40 or 50 students show up, I alone can't join all the breakout sessions to help everyone. So my TAs are in there every single time with me, and having them helps us help more students. And the other thing is now we've all expanded our office hours, and I know that's a big help as well for those students who cannot make it to the synchronous sessions but need additional help on the course activities. The TAs have really been helpful with that aspect. And of course, there's still the grading aspect that they're still helping with.
Fabulous. I see Joan mentioned the use of mentors and holding sessions. So it sounds like everyone is using as many resources as possible when it comes to colleagues or other student workers or TAs as much as possible. Well, I think that this has been a great discussion. There's obviously a lot of concern about that balance between synchronous and asynchronous. I can tell you that from all of the help tickets and conversations I've had with faculty through my work, that this has been coming up on everyone's mind. So no one is alone in that concern. I think that everyone is absolutely right that no one wants to sit on WebEx for hours at a time. It's just not the same as a face-to-face classroom. I think that a lot of people are looking more and more into those asynchronous elements and sort of reserving the synchronous time for sort of those top items that they feel it would be the most beneficial. I do want to point out that synchronous meeting times in an online class do have to be either something that was mentioned when students registered in Banner. If it is actually advertised as an asynchronous online class, your synchronous sessions would then have to be optional. Not to say that you can't hold them, but there have to be alternative options or multiple meeting times. And essentially, because the student signed up for an asynchronous course, they cannot in any way be punished or lose material or points or something for missing the synchronous sessions. But if you are thinking that you in future semesters, as you look at possibly continuing to teach online, that you want to have synchronous sessions, that is something that can be coded in Banner. So that's something else that we've just seen a lot coming up, people asking, well, how much can I do synchronously? And it kind of also depends on what your course is coded at. So I just wanted to point that out since we've had so many questions lately about that. Any final thoughts from anyone? Anyone is welcome to jump in. I've been reading some of the chat pieces out loud specifically because as this is a recording and the chat I don't believe is part of the recording. Bobby has shared an infographic that I will try to grab this link and share it also in that email follow-up. So if you if the link isn't working for you, or I will send an email so you can access it after this. But final thoughts, everyone.
Joan had a thought about changing a banner, so a hybrid course. Synchronous, asynchronous code. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that that would be really nice if Banner could also, yeah, specify something that was kind of more, not a perfect 50-50 split necessarily, but something that was more clear about, hey, there will be some meeting online, but not as much as like a face-to-face 3 times a week kind of a thing. So I think that's a really great point. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. You are all fabulous. And again, thank you to our panelists for giving their time to us. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please let me know. We are more than happy to help with any of that. And of course, we are going to try to have more sessions like this in the future if our fabulous panelists are willing to maybe give a little of their time again. But again, I do have this as a recording. So if you have any colleagues who say, I would really like to have seen that, please let them know that this is something that we would be able to send them. So thank you again, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful Tuesday.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Take care.